I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments. And the question is, well, and of course, you should put air quotes around those, plausible arguments,
Yeah.
because that's kind of sarcasm or Paul being sassy. But what I think he's getting at is, what are these arguments? Are these just arguments in general? Are these just fine-sounding arguments in general? Or is it more about having a negative view of the human body, a negative view of the self?
Say that everything which begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore it must have a cause. It must be an uncaused cause, and that uncaused cause is God. We use all these books and have all these arguments to try and reason to God. We have arguments that conclude God. God is not a God that we can reason to. He's the God that we can't reason without. Paul in Colossians 2 says, in Christ are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Why do you think Paul told us that? He tells us in the very next verse. I tell you this so no one may deceive you by fine-sounding arguments. What do we have? Fine-sounding arguments. This is Paul's warning to Timothy. Guard what has been entrusted to your care. Turn away from godless chatter and the opposing ideas of what is falsely called knowledge. What is false knowledge? See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world, rather than on Christ.
All right, so let's go to Colossians 2, 3-8. And this one's a super fun one because it's one of those ones people like to use to say that philosophy is bad. So let's get into that.
All right. Oh, yes, this one. Yeah, I remember seeing this one come up. I get, this one's interesting because I get the logic of what's saying. I just don't think it's being properly interpreted or extracted.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, by all means.
All right. So yeah, this one's super common as far as presuppositional apologetics goes. It starts off by saying, Colossians 2:4 says, I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments. Okay, so what is he saying so that people won't be convinced of these arguments? He's saying, in whom Jesus are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And if you're a presuppositionalist, that sounds a lot like the transcendental argument for God that says, God is the precondition for knowledge, intelligibility, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, presuppositional is kind of against the argument for traditional apologetics kind of thing, where you're trying to prove God with evidence or whatever. So it seems like Paul the author of Colossians. Is that right?
I think he is. There's debate about it, but I think Paul wrote Colossians. Yeah.
Okay, so Paul's just trying to say, hey, don't do these arguments because you have this. Jesus is needed for wisdom and knowledge. And then, of course, later it says, see to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit according to human tradition. Oh, what is human tradition? Trying to prove God. So what do you think of these passages?
Yeah, I can see, like I said, the logic. I think with Colossians, you have kind of a debate over who's Paul arguing with, right? Who's his interlocutors? And the consensus seems to be either some sort of syncretism, some sort of syncretistic, religions kind of being mingled together, or some sort of proto or pre-Gnostic kind of tradition. In any sense, what you have here, of course, is an ideology based on other things, and we can actually go to the end of the passage. Language about do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, and talking about these regulations and self-imposed worship at the end of the chapter, verse 23, false humility, and what is also interesting, their severity or harsh treatment, abuse of the body. So there's this sense in which the interlocutor has a very dim view of the human body. And that's, of course, if we read Romans 8, Paul has a very strong view of the human body insofar as you're not getting a new one in heaven. You're not going to be cast for the ghost. We look forward to the resurrection, or rather the liberation of our bodies, not being liberated from our bodies, So there's not this kind of Gnostic kind of idea here. But that's kind of what Paul's arguing, the people he's arguing with. And so when we get to here, with the mystery of God, namely Christ, or who is Christ. And so Christ is the embodiment of the mystery of God made flesh. And that's the big Christological claim in verse 9. For in Christ all the fullness of deity or divinity, deity dwells bodily or in bodily form. And so the mystery of God is incarnate. The mystery of God is in fleshed for us. And so we can kind of again, going what Paul said, we can test and see that Christ is here, that Christ was with us, that Christ was present. And so verse 4 says, I say this in order that no one may delude you with plausible arguments. And the question is, well, and of course, you should put air quotes around those, plausible arguments.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of sarcasm or Paul being sassy. But what I think he's getting at is, what are these arguments? Are these just arguments in general? Are these just fine-sounding arguments in general? Or is it more about having a negative view of the human body, a negative view of the self, kind of a rival philosophy that seems to promote forms of asceticism, or asceticism in an abusive sense, not an asceticism as a spiritual practice. There are differences to be said there. Mistreatment of the body or severity of the body, and stuff like that. And so it's like, okay, is he talking about arguments in relation to those sorts of practices or ideas? And I think that makes best sense because, chapter 2, verse 16, therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, or a new moon celebration on a Sabbath day, and these sorts of rituals or maybe syncretistic aspects of pagan, we would say pagan religion. And pagan, I'm not speaking negatively, it's a common kind of phrase, non-Christian religion. And so Paul is essentially arguing that Christ is, of course, the embodiment of God incarnate. Christ is the lens by which we view everything. And don't be persuaded that Christ isn't at the center of all reality, the center of all that we do. Now, of course, that doesn't get you to presuppositionalism, because every Christian affirms that Jesus is Lord, then Jesus is Lord over everything. And then you get to the language of not being taken captive through hollow or deceptive philosophy. So he's qualifying the type of philosophy. It's not that all philosophy, but he's qualifying what kind of philosophy, which is dependent or in accordance with human tradition and the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ. And so you even have the language of the worship of angels or worshiping with angels in Colossians. And so there's all these kind of principalities, powers, supernatural, evil, mysterious forces that are going on in these sort of assemblies. And so he's going basically, the problem isn't philosophy, because Paul is using a lot of philosophical rhetoric, especially in Philippians. But what he does say is hollow and deceptive or misleading. So philosophy is not by nature that. And so, or at least, good philosophy is about asking questions and learning and seeking after truth. It's like logic. It's just what it is. But philosophy can be used in a hollow or deceptive sense. And I think it just goes too far to have Paul saying basically what the presuppositionalist is saying about philosophy or often logic. Oh, you're a philosopher, I just read the Bible, which is incredibly philosophical because that implies a whole lot of things about a whole lot of things. I don't know if that helps, but that's just kind of what I see going on in the passage.